sometimes people say it's a pleasure to introduce somebody, but they're just saying that. I mean, I really mean it. Like, I would, I would go the distance to meet up with Viet wherever he is. So we are really, really lucky today to have Viet Nguyen, Dr. Nguyen, with us today. He is currently Chief Standards Implementation Officer at HL7, but Viet also has a long and storied and diverse history from when he completed his MD to starting his own practice to Med Peds dual certified, finished his PhD at one of the top informatics programs in the country.
No PhD. No, don't give me.
Okay, that's right. You're like me. That's right. That's right. No, totally right. But has really been like one of the early sort of experts in standards. I think in your fellowship, and then since then has done work in industry. Has founded his own consulting company, Stratometrics, and managed to do all this and be the, I would say, I don't know if I can say this yet, but you are the premier fire guy in the country. We'll hear about that today. Like, it is like, when I think of fire, instantly, like in my dictionary, it goes right to see his face. So just to point out that he is really the person that you want to learn from about standards implementation, and also about what the latest is with fire. So I'll turn it over to Viet, and he can tell you anything that comes out of his mouth. We should listen to.
Oh, Abel, you're too kind. I appreciate all the kind words, but I want to clearly acknowledge that I get to be the cheerleader when it comes to fire and interoperability in HL7. I get to promote
I think we're having a little bit of a technical glitch with Viet.
Okay, hold on. Hopefully the internet is going to catch up with him. Let's see. It'll hopefully pop back in a second.
Well, he is in Utah, so
it is Utah. So.
Maybe there's like sunstroke or something.
The whole country was covered in rain. Maybe that was part of it. It was just the only thing that can extinguish fire is rain. So I guess,
right. I will text him and see if
we can get him back in.
Oh, okay. It looks like he might have lost his connection. We will.
We don't have those like cool like things that say stand by technical difficulties, but
I know we should think about having that.
I think he's back.
Hey.
Yeah,
okay,
back.
He's back.
Okay, but we might be
on mute.
You
have to unmute.
Sorry about that. I'm a fire guy, not a network infrastructure guy. So I apologize. Are my slides back up?
They are, yes.
Okay, great. I apologize. If this happens again, Zoom will try to reconnect me and we'll get back as quickly as we can. So thanks for the introduction. If you didn't hear me say this, I'm really here to promote and celebrate the work of really thousands of folks and the community around fire. I recognize that many of you may not be familiar with standards development and are learning about fire and really want to see how you can use fire in creating innovative technologies, improving healthcare and public health. So my hope is by the end of this presentation, you'll have some familiar and a broad landscape view of where we are in interoperability and fire in particular, and how this is a great time to be in informatics and working in interoperability and developing applications. Abel and I have been doing this for 20 years, and I've never been as optimistic as I have been in the last couple of years with regard to interoperability. So I hope that you'll feel this enthusiasm that I feel when we get to the end of this. But just to give you some context, I work for HL7 as the Chief Standards Implementation Officer. HL7 is a not-for-profit. It's an ANSI accredited standards development organization. So we follow a set of criteria and get reevaluated each 5 years, I think, to make sure that we have good standards that allow the public to participate in standards work and get a perspective from a broad range of the community. Where our focus is really healthcare data standards, We don't work in finance and other areas. We have 3 product families. If you've worked in the hospital, you're maybe familiar with version 2, which has been around for 30 years and really is still the mainstay of interoperability within the hospital and communicating with labs. We have the version 3, or in the US, we call the Clinical Document Exchange Standard, which is an XML-based standard that allows us to take information, put it into an XML document, deliver it from a hospital to a provider, or payer to provider, and it does work really pretty well. And we send millions of these a day. But the challenge that we had in CDA is that it's a document, and once you create a document, it's old. And in healthcare, you really need the most up-to-date information. And so we're going to talk about FHIR, because FHIR really is going to enable healthcare, not only in the US, but globally, to really enter this, the modern API era that other industries like finance and travel have done over the past 10 or 15 years. So HL7 is a global organization with a presence really around the entire world, and we've just established some initial incubator groups within Africa as well. So this map will hopefully in the near future be practically all blue. So I want to show you this to give you some context around FHIR and this conversation. We're now 12 years old. So I never describe FHIR as emerging, new, innovative, around the corner. It's here. And I say that I've gone through an evolution in how I talk about FHIR. In 2014, when I started talking about FHIR, people asked me, what's FHIR? And then they asked me, why FHIR? Then they asked me how FHIR, because they realized that it does work. And now they're asking when FHIR. And when FHIR is now, because as you can see through this course of the last 12 years, we've gone from federal guidance around the need for open APIs, the creation of the Argonaut project, and the release of FHIR profiles that are used now across the country. 97% of hospitals have FHIR-enabled EHRs. Not all of them may have turned it on, but the vast majority have. And over 85% of outpatient physicians have access to EHRs that use FHIR. And so over the course of the last 10 years, Apple's adopted FHIR in their Health Kit. So you could pull out your phone today, go into Health Kit, look up your nearest hospital or practice, and be able to use your patient login to get your clinical data via FHIR. In 2020, CMS identified FHIR and required adoption by publicly funded insurance programs like Medicare Advantage and CHIP to adopt FHIR to make that data available to patients, which is awesome. And we just finished, we're in the midst of a rulemaking period where we're responding to CMS proposed regulatory rules around adopting FHIR for prior authorization. And so we're being driven by the adoption of FHIR, not only for its value in healthcare and interoperability, but also recognized by the federal government as important to building a national infrastructure where we can share clinical data and administrative data for patient care and administrative purposes. But FHIR fits into a life cycle. And I think that's really important for you all to understand, because most folks don't work in standards development. They pick up standards and adopt them. And what we realized in HL7 is that it's really a virtuous cycle where we go from identifying a need for a standard to planning and funding projects to develop these standards. And I'm going to talk about groups called the accelerators that do this work, to actually creating the standard with the community's input around data, workflow requirements. And then we create these FHIR profiles, which are the data models that we use in FHIR, as well as operations, which are the API definitions about how you do certain workflow processes. And I know you had a talk on APIs, and the way I described APIs are, think about things that you used to work with humans to do that could then be standardized and repeatable. And the example is, you need to book a flight. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, before the era of Expedia, which is 26, 27 years old now, we called up a travel agent. We gave them our dates of travel, our origin, destination, and maybe a preference of an airline, or maybe not. They took that information, they went into their systems. At the time, I think it's Sabre is one of the systems. They found that information and came back with options for us. We said, I'll take that option. They book it, they get us an itinerary. Who's done that recently? I know I haven't, because I go to either Expedia or one of the travel websites, or I can go directly to Delta to book my flights. And we do that with APIs. We give the websites the same information. They do a bunch of work in the background and return information for us. Essentially what FHIR is the API definition for healthcare. So we can represent clinical and administrative data in FHIR, and we can get to that data and do workflow, work with that data via FHIR. And so this process allows us to define those FHIR standards. We put them through an ANSI balloting process to make sure there's good public comment around them. And then we publish them, and my role as implementation officer is to help the community then to adopt them. So this is the view from HL7 and people involved in standards process, but the real view is this, which is we want to get the standards out into the global marketplace so then folks can create the innovations that are possible with respect to FHIR, folks like you all. So if you look at travel, there was a day when it was primarily Expedia, but now there's 6, 7, 8, 9 platforms, because getting to the data and booking flights and hotels isn't the value proposition. The value proposition is the cheapest package you can get, or the most interesting locations, or the deals. So imagine that getting to the data for clinical care, always with privacy and security in mind, isn't supposed to be the hard part, which it has historically been. It's now, what can you do with that data? What knowledge can you derive from that data, and what insights you can do, and how can you apply that to improving patient care? So the work I do is within the standards implementation division, and we have a whole number of different areas that we work on, from education to developing a technical ecosystem for testing and community outreach, much like this kind of activity to help promote the work of FHIR. And this diagram on the right was created by my deputy implementation officer, Diego Kaminker, to represent that we have all kinds of communities in healthcare. And we want to help you move along the spiral to the point where you better understand not just the standards, but then ultimately maybe some of you will get involved in developing standards and helping us to improve the FHIR standard. And one area of focus for me is this, what we call the FHIR Accelerator Program. And the FHIR Accelerator Program now, and I'll show you some of them, are a program by which we change the model by which you engage with HL7. In the past, an organization like CMS or a vendor, says, "Oh, we really need a standard to do X, to exchange X," and then they'll hire a contractor, or maybe they're already involved in HL7. They'll come to a work group and say, "We really want to develop this. Help us find the community to develop this." And you develop it, and you hope that the people will pick it up. Sometimes with the regulations, they have to, but for the most part, it really is relying on how well can you bring the community together to adopt the standards that you develop. With the accelerator program, we've turned it around. We create the community first. And that community has a particular domain focus, and they decide as a group that there's enough work to do there in a multi-year, multi-stakeholder initiative to identify opportunities to improve interoperability, develop the implementation guides and reference implementations, and be a ready community for implementation. And together, as the accelerator, their accelerant are the funds that they provide to bring in and pay subject matter experts and FHIR experienced developers, as well as their own human resources and their subject matter expertise that helps us in the process of identifying scope and breadth of the specification we want to develop. And so I'm really proud of this accelerator program. It used to be more bespoke, and each accelerator is just a little different. And what we've done in the past year in my role is to really develop a blueprint, a way that we can standardize the approach of bringing the accelerator, a group together to decide, is this accelerator make sense? And is it a sustainable model and a set of activities that they can do? So we have 8 accelerators now, and it's really is a wide range of activities that I'm going to share with you next. And these accelerators bring in organizations, global organizations, regulatory, patients, providers, payers, the whole 9 yards, because every kind of organization has a role in standards development, whether they focus on the policy part, the development part, or the implementation part. And for some of them, like the big federal agencies, they do all of it. So it's important that we hear from industry when we're developing standards, because there's often, not always, but often already either an established standard that isn't working very well, or an established workflow that we want to apply a standard to. And very rarely, and sometimes unfortunately, we want to standardize a practice, a workflow that doesn't have any standardized workflow in it. And those are the hardest kind of situations. But really bringing folks together to agree that there's important work to be done and to work on it together is the goal of a fire accelerator. And so with that, we work within the HL7 process. Don't memorize this, but it really just is to show folks that the accelerator work within HL7 is all around the standards work, and that we are governed by the ANSI accredited processes we apply to developing fire standards. And ultimately what we publish has that level of rigor that the standards process allows us to have. And so when we publish it and it gets identified in federal regulations, the regulators have the same kind of assurance that they've met some levels of quality. So these are the 4 phases of a fire accelerator. Many of them are in this operational and growth phase. We have a couple that are, I've had some early conversations that are in the inception phase to figure out, is there something there? So hopefully the next time we get a chance to talk to this group, we'll be able to announce a couple of new accelerators that have spun up. But let me go in now to a brief description of each of these accelerators. And some of these are really important for you to be aware of, and some of those I think you should be aware of if they happen to be in a domain that you're interested in. So the first accelerator, and before we even had the term fire accelerator, was the Argonaut project. And they really came out of that 2014 report from the JASON task force around the need to have open APIs in healthcare. And so we had the JASON report, and so they created the Argonauts. We like our puns in fire, and I've yet to have to put $1 in the kitty for making a fire pun, but they abound. So the Argonaut project is a collaborative between providers, payers, vendors. So the same groups participate in multiple accelerators, but I describe their work as trying to identify important new technologies to advance fire capabilities. And so the use of smart on fire, the ability to get data out of EHRs that I can, if I had other time, you could show you in my phone, the ability to do CDS hooks, which allows you to trigger fire events and share data via fire within the EHR workflow, the bulk data capability that allows us to share large volumes of patient data asynchronously instead of in real time, because there are large volumes of data. These are initiatives that were started out by the Argonaut project and then ultimately became implementation guides that were validated and adopted into fire. So as you're learning not only the fire base specifications, I call these all the fire technologies that are associated with them. So they're working currently on how to do the electronic health information export API, how to write data back to EHRs, which if you're a developer, you can see how challenging that would be. But also if you're a clinician, you can see how important it would be to take data you're getting from patients or other providers, putting it back into the EHR so you can use them as if they were native to do things like clinical decision support or drug checking. They also work on the US CDI, the US core profiles in fire, which are the a required standard within the US for how you represent a common set of data like patients, providers, lab observations, clinical conditions. And the importance of that is it really standardizes what's available today and is part of the certification that health IT vendors like EHR vendors have to comply with and had to certify by December 31st of last year. And now that they've certified, they're going to be rolling it out to their customers as part of the update and refresh cycle of their EHRs. The next one is the Karen Alliance, and this is really primarily alphabetical order except for one. The Karen Alliance really focuses on the, they call it the consumer to business relationship in healthcare. So they developed an implementation guide that's in federal regulations around the use of the Blue Button initiative, which allows individuals in like Medicare Advantage and CHIP to be able to download their claims information. So for those of you who've had multiple doctor visits or had conditions where you had to get surgeries and you get all these explanation of benefits and you're trying to sort them out and figure out which ones do I pay, which ones do I not pay, and it's very confusing. And so the idea here with this Blue Button is the ability to put it all into one FHIR payload, and then application developers can then take that information and make it more user-friendly to individuals who are downloading it. So very useful, and they're expanding, and they're also doing work on identity management and other things that aren't directly FHIR, but they are relating to the whole health IT ecosystem. Codex is another FHIR accelerator focused primarily on the making sure that data for a given clinical domain has a clear model for representation when you want to extract it from an EHR. So the US core that I described is very general: observations, conditions, patient. What they don't do necessarily is have it for oncology. So the Codex started out by working with the oncology community to identify what does it mean to represent oncology data for registries, for clinical trials, and now they're working on a little bit for prior auth, so that the EHR vendors can adopt these things and make them available via FHIR resources. So they do the very difficult task of developing good standardized terminology and FHIR extensions. So reminding you about FHIR, you have these base FHIR resources, which are international. You have profiles that are constrained to be used in either a certain realm like the US, or for a certain area of care, like say oncology. And within those profiles, you can add additional elements called extensions. And that allows you to extend the data model, but still make them interoperable through kind of conformance artifacts that is probably beyond the reach of this this particular conversation, but I hope you'll learn about, because it's a very powerful aspect of FHIR. So they're expanding to also work in the genomics realm as well as the cardiology realm. I noticed that a number of you are working on some social determinants of health. So if you're not already familiar with the Gravity project, it is a FHIR accelerator that really transformed into a FHIR accelerator from some early work from UCSF and the Siren community. They formed ultimately a FHIR accelerator, and they're focused on how to represent social determinants of health data via FHIR. So their initial work was just on the terminology. How do you make sure that you can ask the right questions when it comes to food insecurity or transportation or housing, and be able to have standardized terminology in order to capture that information, in order for it to be shared, aggregated, and analyzed. So they developed that work, and were actually able to get it into the US core data for interoperability, US CDI. That is version 2. So now we're on version 4, but that's also another conversation. And they're working with their community to make FHIR more accessible to a community that really was adjacent to healthcare, but not really within the healthcare technology ecosystem. Organizations like United Way, or the Catholic Community Services, or the Jewish Community Services, or the different religious organizations that provide these kind of social services and support. Those organizations certainly have to deal with healthcare information, but we're really never connected into the health ecosystem. So they're developing the terminology and ultimately a set of workflows to not only capture social determinants of health and use that information to identify areas of risk, but also to then share that information, always appropriately and with security and privacy in mind, with those community organizations in order to deliver the care to meet those needs for the community. Helios is a relatively new one. They're a little more than a year old now. They were formed by the public health community, led very much by the CDC, and their goal is to really advance the adoption of fire and building a national kind of public health ecosystem. I'll just say it because it's obvious, but the COVID pandemic really pointed out how fragile our ability to exchange essential public health information in the midst of a pandemic, and so Helios is really helping us to plan for the next one, because inevitably there will be some local, or hopefully not, pandemic in the future that we need to be able to share data. And so they're leveraging a lot of what we've already built in FHIR, like bulk data. They're looking at how could we use bulk data for sharing immunization data, because that's important both at the school where kids are moving in and need to make sure they comply with immunization requirements, to the state level for making sure we have good immunization programs and documenting them, all the way to sharing it at the national level to the CDC, so we can look at immunization rates. And so we think we have a good opportunity to leverage existing technologies around FHIR to do that. They're also looking at how would they gather data on specific patients right out of the EHR for things like case reporting. You may not be familiar, but if you're in one of the physicians in the audience, you know that there are reportable diseases that clinicians and hospitals and others have to report when they're detected. Often public health folks will go into the medical record to look for others who might be exposed, to do what they call a case report. Right now, that's very manual. They have to be able to log into an EHR or sit in the hospital along with somebody who is authorized to sit, look at the EHR and gather data and document it. We want to use FHIR to do that, and to ease that burden and accelerate the capture of that data and the sharing of that data. For those of you in the academic realm, we have the Vulcan accelerator. They're a couple of years old now. They're really focused on a combination of clinical research and pharma. And they have a number of really interesting projects going on, real world data, to look at how we can extract data for things like post-payment, not post-payment, but post-marketing surveillance, and to gather data for FDA submissions. How to represent the schedule of activities of a clinical trial using FHIR, so you could track progress. How to take the onion skin paper insert that's in your medicine bottles, if you happen to get them in a box at the pharmacy. That information today is actually represented in CDA, but they want to make that information available via FHIR to make that information not just readable, but actually usable by a clinical decision support. So if you know the drug has drug-in-drug interactions, and the pharma manufacturer has to document all that, why not use that information that they have to document in patient care and reuse that information? So there are lots of really great activities in Vulcan. FAST is the Fire at Scale Task Force. So we need to take all these great individual use cases and build a national infrastructure around that. So what we do is we take the fire accelerators that we have on the left, that think of them as being the vehicles that drive on this infrastructure as workflows, and build the actual infrastructure and look at things that every process needs to be aware of: identity management, security, finding the appropriate API endpoints, and then developing the guidance or implementation guides that can support the community in scaling FHIR. And not only that, supporting some of the regulatory activities related to what's called TEFCA, which is an initiative. Actually, I think it's a legislative requirement to establish this national infrastructure. So this is where the standards work affects very much directly the policy work that's happening in the US. And then finally, the last group, I'm going to spend a little bit of time, then we'll have some time for Q&A, because I know I talk really fast sometimes when I talk about FHIR. But along with being the implementation officer for HL7 for the last 5 years, I think maybe 6 years now, I have been the technical director for the HL7 Da Vinci project. And it is a FHIR accelerator formed by providers, payers, and vendors in health IT. And their area of focus is around payer-provider interoperability. Things like prior authorization or quality measures. And so we have over 50 members that come together, and collectively over the past 5 years have published 14 implementation guides. And I found out just yesterday, one of them had a version 2 of their implementation guide just published. And these guides range from guides that support exchange of clinical data between payers and providers, to exchange of clinical and administrative data from payers to payers, to burden reduction, to making information for patients around their formulary and their provider networks readily available via FHIR, to other things like quality. And now we've for the past few months been working on value-based care. How do you represent the contracted measures of how well you're performing in a value-based care contract, to risk adjustment, is identifying patients that are high risk, that are being seen and their care is addressed, and payers need documentation so that they can get a payment adjustment from Medicare. So all these were use cases that were identified by the Da Vinci community as being high value. Not everyone agrees with every use case, but at least for each use case, we have at least 2/3 of the community saying it's really important. We tried to pare away some of these a few years ago, and we were roundly told not to. So this is a good example of community-driven work in FHIR. And if you look here, we have they're color coded. So I apologize for those of you who may be red, green, colorblind, or have difficulty seeing this. But the idea here is that we often get asked, well, what am I going to implement? You have so many implementation guides. How do I decide which ones are important? So we created this approach to help organizations to look at each of these guides and say, oh, is there a regulatory requirement around that? Because that's a driver. That means you're going to need to do it. And for these 3 were actually identified in the recent proposed rule from CMS for prior authorization. These 2 were identified in previous and now final rules from CMS for patient access. These 2 as well, payer data exchange and member attribution. So we have a number of these guides that are now required for implementation by providers and payers, and secondarily by their vendors who provide EHR or revenue cycle technologies. So just to kind of reinforce where FHIR is, we're just submitted our response to 2 rules around interoperability. One is this advancing interoperability for prior authorization. So there, I believe, 5 FHIR implementation guides from Da Vinci that were identified in that rule, and it also based its requirements around the ONC requirements for certification that included things like US Core I mentioned, bulk FHIR that I mentioned, SMART. And why that's important is that when these FHIR capabilities are required for certification by EHR vendors or health IT vendors more generally, they become APIs and capabilities that can be leveraged by others. So if you're at Northwestern, I think you all are an Epic shop, and you have an EHR that's enabled in FHIR, you know that there's some baseline capability that then if you're a clinical researcher and you want to be able to get data more easily, you might be able to leverage the FHIR capabilities in the EHR or in the whole kind of ecosystem, as opposed to going to the research informatics officer and saying, I have a project, I need these data elements, I need an ETL of the data so I can put it into my research. There's a lot in what I just said that is very burdensome and very time consuming and very inefficient in creating your own data models and extracting data that way. It would be much more efficient if we used FHIR at the beginning, capture data by FHIR that is native to the EHR, extend that data by capturing it through Smart on FHIR apps within the EHR, and then gathering them, exchanging them, and analyzing them as core FHIR data instead of, excuse me, transforming them at each step and losing something along the way. And so the other proposed rule that was released was actually not a FHIR rule. It's something called attachments. And it has to do with how payers and providers exchange clinical information for things like claims and prior auth. And they actually identified the clinical document exchange, which is what another policy-making organization called NCVHS recommended like 7 years ago. And in the interim, FHIR has matured dramatically. And so our primary take on this response is that they should pull it back and not go forward with a final rule, and look at using FHIR for this, because one of the implementation guides that we developed, this clinical data exchange, actually supports the use of FHIR. And so we don't want them to kind of instantiate old technology when we have better new technology that is the path forward. So I've given you a lot. This is the HL7 kind of a screenshot of the Confluence page. So if you go to confluence.hl7.org, you can find out more about all of our work groups that develop our specifications, the FHIR Accelerator program. We have all these international affiliates. So there are lots of opportunities to participate in standards work, or the working group meetings and connectathons. We do technical work as well. And I wanted to make a pitch that next week, if you go to hl7.org and get the main home webpage, I have a presentation next week on FHIR for policy folks. So if you have any of you are interested in policy, we'll have a webinar next Thursday. And then in May, we have our working group meeting. So there's a link to our working group meeting, and we're expanding that working group meeting to what we call Working Group Meeting Plus, or WGM Plus. And we have a whole program geared towards implementers who would not come to a standards development meeting, but would come because we have FHIR education, we have keynote talks by a number of the federal agencies like CMS and ONC and FDA and NIH, and they'll be talking about their policy initiatives around interoperability and FHIR. So it'd be a really great opportunity if you're looking to see, where the federal agencies are moving towards with respect to FHIR. That's going to be really great. And then we have deep dive presentations too on the implementation guides that I've been mentioning for each of these FHIR accelerators. So it's a really exciting time to be working FHIR and interoperability. But since this is a group that's really focused on creating some projects around AI and FHIR, I wanted to at least list a few things that crossed my mind that I think might be beneficial if you're looking at FHIR in your projects. We think we're getting to the point really that machine learning and AI, the community, there's enough expertise in the community that we're starting to think about how do we want to represent AI and ML artifacts as FHIR. So what's come up is, if you create a model, machine learning model, what's its provenance? Who created, what was the test data that was based on? And so that you can exchange it in a way that others can have some reassurance. But even before you get to that, can you develop some machine learning models based on FHIR resources? Because FHIR, of course, if you've looked at it, it's NoSQL, so it's more amenable to a graph database than a traditional relational database. So how can you develop machine learning models using FHIR as its base model, as opposed to transforming it into a relational database or some traditional forms of creating models? Because you all probably recognize that the model that you create is very dependent on the data. And if your data is in a proprietary data model, to apply your final ML model, you might not be able to apply it on different data models. So if we looked at using FHIR as the kind of global data model, how could we create the machine learning models based on that? And then once you have models, how do you implement them in clinical decision support, in population health tools that you can use those models to identify risk factors and potentially to guide or help inform clinical decision support? And where I get worried that we're making more and more data available via FHIR, we're making clinicians responsible for this data. So I think it'd be hugely valuable to say, how can I identify high value data for the clinician so that when they get a gigabyte of clinical data, that's 10 years worth of clinical data, they can identify the high value points and have the other background data available if they have to dig into it. I think there's a significant issue for us going forward. There are many, many more. I mean, anything you can think of that you do ML to find insights, to apply those insights to care, risk models, financial models. There's an opportunity to look and see how we can do that in fire. And so along with going to the hl7.org website to find events, you can go to Confluence to find all these projects. And if you're a developer, I encourage you to go to chat.fire.org, which is the implementers forum. You can get a free login. And this is where we have all kinds of communities who've created streams of conversations, including analytics and machine learning on fire. There's even one, blockchain on fire, although it hasn't been that active. So there's all these opportunities for you to engage more in fire, whether you're a clinician, whether you're an analyst, a policymaker, or a developer. So I think it's a really great time to be working in interoperability in general and fire in particular. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to kind of present this to you. I'm going to go take a look now at the chat and see if I can answer anything in chat. So I'm going to go off.
Yeah, while people are thinking about that, so as the Chief Standards Implementation Officer, when you look at the accelerators, what do you see are the most common barriers that inhibit progress at, for example, for an institution? Is it awareness issues? Is it lack of resources, like expertise, for example? Is it the standards don't exist yet? I mean, where are you seeing the biggest blockers, especially for, let's say, like gravity or Helios? I think those are the two that are really acutely, we're involved in some of those types of initiatives.
Yeah, I think knowledge and understanding of fire and the role of fire and the opportunities with fire and workforce. I'm acutely concerned about how do we train workforce, both the healthcare professionals that understand the historical aspects of healthcare and the current technologies like X12 and others, and then bringing in the new graduates or folks who have technology knowledge as graduates or other industries. And what we're learning is that the API stuff's not the hard stuff for them.
Yeah.
They can write an API, they've done Swagger, but what they don't understand is what's the appropriate value set? What's coded terminology? Because I think for the most part, many of them have worked in innovation in other fields that may not have an industry standard, and so haven't had to apply a standard. So they got to create it. So we're trying to train folks at all those realms because we need folks who understand workflow. We need analysts who can convert the workflow and read an implementation guide, and then talk to a developer to explain how that implementation guide applies to a particular organization's implementation of fire. So there are all these opportunities. You don't have to be a developer. We need good analysts who understand fire and workflows. And so that's why I think we have to train more and more folks. And the reality is everyone has some financial constraints. They can't all be innovators.
Right. And at the institutional level, I find that many people in institution maybe not even know about, they may have never even heard of fire, which is interesting to me. And then working with their own vendors, they may not be aware that the functionality exists. They just need to open up the API or activate it or whatever they need to do with it through the vendor. How much of the work that you do is really just sort of teaching people that here's a tricycle and here you put your feet. I mean, it's really just sort of because I feel like there's the awareness part is still a problem right now. So many people. Yeah,
it depends on the organization, certainly. I spend a good chunk of my time doing these kind of education activities. We do it at AMIA. We go to conferences and things. So it depends on the organization. I tend to work with organizations that have interoperability as a strategic initiative. So I use that term very specifically because most organizations see interoperability as a compliance requirement. And so the way I've changed some of my language is imagine yourself with what you know today with APIs and the modern internet technology, ecosystem. How would you have advised Borders books differently, or brick and mortar retailer differently, or travel agency company differently? Because healthcare is slow. we love to be innovative, but we're slow. We have a lot of inertia because we want to try to be safe, and you know, there's a lot of legacy data. But this is really an opportunity to do that same kind of transformation that other industries have done with APIs. And when I look at the hype curve on upcoming technologies, I don't see anything that it's going to supplant APIs in terms of interoperability. So in my opinion, it's going to be around, hopefully. I'm not even going to say hopefully, I'm confident that it's going to be around until I retire.
No, I think that's a fairly safe bet. I think Ali had a question, and actually, I don't know now how this works. We have to read it out because they can't unmute
Sure,
it.
I'll read it out. So what is your perception regarding the adoption and use of bulk fire across health systems? Our organization prioritizing bulk fire as an alternative to other forms of large-scale health information export. So number one, bulk fire is part of EHR certification. So it's been implemented in EHRs. I don't think the issue is technology. I think the issue is policy and agreements, because an organization, when they make information available via bulk, that's like opening up a gold mine. And you want to make sure that whoever gets that data has appropriate use of that data, that they can appropriately craft their queries so that they're only accessing data that they are allowed to use. And I think that is a barrier for use of bulk fire, not for its implementation and adoption. Hope that works. Good. So for Rufus, how is FIRE working with tools like GPT-4 and other NLP frameworks? Are they going to be important moving forward? I'm confident they're going to be important moving forward. We haven't tried to tackle that in HL7 quite yet, but I have had some conversations with folks from MITRE Corporation, who does a lot of work in FIRE, where they used ChatGPT, I think it was 3.5, and asked it to create FIRE resources for a fictional patient who was a vampire. And they created value sets, extensions in a build. And he showed me his conversation with ChatGPT, and even to the point of creating profiles. I think there might be good opportunities to help doing some of the hard things around creating synthetic data potentially, or looking at, quick turnaround, creating profiles and extensions. We haven't explored it quite yet because we still have a lot of work just getting folks to use the base standard and understanding how important it is to train their workforce. But I'm optimistic around the opportunities there. But I think, Ngan, did you want to mention something too?
Yeah, I suddenly lost my host privilege. But I did want to ask you, as you look forward into the future, like you alluded to, that there are a couple of opportunities to become accelerators. What are some of those interesting opportunities? I'm curious.
Oh, I can't really name them on a recorded public call because I have folks.
All right, fine.
Yeah, I have at least
nice try,
in the wings, and for everything from clinical to manufacturing to quality. That's broad enough that they have to still come together, because we help them and coach them, but we don't actually define their scope.
I think it's for folks who are listening who this may be one of the first times they heard about FIRE. Is there a plug you want to make? I mean, like making it tangible for them. Like, let's say they're thinking about putting together a new app, or like, what does embedding FIRE capability within their app, what does that get them? What does that bring to them?
Out of the box interoperability. So if you're thinking about the software development lifecycle, you get requirements. Often you get workflow requirements, but then you also develop data requirements. And if you're traditionally, people then say, okay, I need a data model. Maybe I'll just create my own data model. And if you're in greenfield, you can. If you have legacy systems, you can't. But I tell folks, don't create your own data model. Start with FIRE. And if you're in the US, start with US core. Because if you're going to...
Who knows? we maybe just lost Viet.
Yeah, seems like we've lost it a little bit. For those of you who don't, know that there is actually a final rule around automating prior auth, and so a lot of the work around NLP and GPT-4, I think, hinges upon some of the ability for that data to be exchanged. So just kind of my commentary on that.
Yeah, and I think it was a leading question, but when you embed standards within your application, what it gets you is it gets you scale. It gets you, the interoperability means that you can work across many different partners. So let's say you install it at one, EHR enabled site. You can say, well, because I have the ability to accept data through a FHIR API, I can now interoperate with other health systems with different EHRs, all of which who likely have a FHIR enabled API. So anyways, now
Sorry about that. I'm glad it happened towards the end and not during the presentation, but the out of the box interoperability, use US core profiles, because if you're going to create data intake things like a patient intake, you have all the value sets to create your dropdown. And if you're going to access data, create data through the EHR or payers, you'll know what those APIs support.
And then I'm not sure if you can see it, if you can log back in, but there's another Q&A from question from CS Park.
I don't. Can you repeat?
I'll read it back to you. CS says, I believe true interoperability requires patient-centric systems rather than existing institution-centric system. What are your thoughts on that architecture?
I love it.
Versus, yeah.
I love it. I use the travel metaphor all the time because people understand that as a very tangible experience they've had. Imagine we use that metaphor, and instead of having a traveler, you have a patient. Instead of having an itinerary, you have a care plan. Instead of having hotels and airlines, you have hospitals, primary care docs, and lab services. And the patient is at the center of that and is able to engage and share that data with all those entities who need to know. The challenge isn't the platform, I think. It's still worth being built. It's having folks care to do it. Because if you look at Intuit and Mint, when Mint first came out and I connected all my bank, I loved it. It was great, but how often did I actually use it? Yeah. So you got to have patients that engage. And the way they get engaged is when they're young, they start a family. When they get a little older, they start to have to take care of their aging parents, which I'm doing. When you get older and you start having chronic disease, you start to care more about that information. It gets more complex. So how do we make that reduce that complexity for the patient and make it more, they can engage more in their own care. And that's really the goal of interoperability and FHIR, and from CMS, cost transparency. We don't have good cost transparency in healthcare. So how do we improve the ability for patients to engage in their own care by knowing how much it's going to cost them? I think those are important aspects.
I mean, I know what you think about it, but it seems to me like the way the legislation has been moving from 21st century cures onwards, it really is moving towards a patient-centric approach. I mean, it really feels to me like they're trying to break that that impasse. And whether or not the institutions are on board or not, some of them are not. Like, it seems like the legislation and the federal regulations will require it. And so I don't know if I feel like at some point in time, people might wake up to a new future someday and be like, oh my gosh, I lost all my like market share because everyone's, empowered with their own data. I don't know what you're.
Yeah, and the way I think of it is that we're not making my colleague Jocelyn, who is the program manager for Da Vinci, would often say that the access to the data should be table stakes, right? You should already be able to do it. Where we need to have folks move is moving up value. What do you do with that data? How do you give a insurance member or a patient the specific data that's actionable and useful to them, and let them decide? How and make, but we don't do that. We hang on to the data. Institutions say it's my data.
I know.
Your data. It's the data to care for your patients. So.
Well, so Abel, I did promise you that we would wrap this up a few minutes early.
Sure.
And so I just want to thank you, Viet, for being, our star panelist again. It's always a
kind.
pleasure to see you.
It really is.
Thank
Thank you, Viet. Couldn't thank you enough. And I owe you a dinner when you get to town.
All right, we'll see you again soon. All right,
Okay.
take care, everyone.
so
Good
much.
luck, everyone, on your projects.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.